Good evening. Welcome back to the Bible Speaks today from LBC Television Ministries here in tonight rainy Latonia. I often wonder why I say that, because if you're watching the program, you've seen the credits, unless of course you're the last minute sit down people, or you're taping this and you duck through the credits, don't we all? You know, every time I record a film, you know, unless the opening shots are part of the action, which of course happens these days, I could straight through it. Or when it opens up, you know, the TV show opens up and something happens, you know, somebody gets killed or there's a chase or something, and then somebody turns to the camera and says, oh, he's been killed. And then we hit the credits and I fast forward through those. I'd like somebody to invent a sensing device. Of course, the advertising and the TV people would scream about it, that would sense a commercial and simply either not record it, and so you never saw it, which of course would make the TV people scream, because that's the whole reason it's on there in the first place, so you can watch the commercials, right? We notice we don't have commercials on this program. Of course, I suppose I go to Netflix or somewhere, that's not without commercials. Anyway, I digress, as they say. We're still talking about the Jebusites. We were talking last week. I kind of rushed through it last week because I was trying to bring new viewers up to speed and go over some things we did on the first program several weeks ago before we kind of changed the order of things. And I apologize if I confused you, but at least we're trying to do it in a logical sort of sequence. So, the Jebusites, and I keep calling them the Jebusites because, as I said in last week's program, we're not quite sure who they were. There's still something, the jury's still out, shall we say. And it's really, here's the kicker about this. We don't really know what happened to them, okay? They didn't fight a battle, they fought a battle over Jerusalem, yes, and they got beaten, but they weren't all put to the sword apparently, because they're still there. And it seems logical, as in so many things about the conquest, as we call it, that they were assimilated by the Israelites. And the reason I say that is, if you go back and take the long view or the broad view of the whole of the end of Genesis through Joshua, the conquest period, and you look at the time frame. Sometimes it's difficult when you read the verses in the Bible. You don't get a sort of time frame kicking away beside you there. There's a couple of charts. If I can get hold of one, I'll pin it up behind me for the next program. But if you think about it, it's believed by many scholars and theologians today that rather than the Israelites coming off the desert and spending a few short years hacking their way through and slaughtering and killing everybody all the way through the country up to Syria, it's more than likely that what they did was gradually come off the desert over a period of about 100, 200 years, which is why we get these sort of 200-year gap things in some of our accounts. That they came off the desert, off the desert in small parties. Take this town, take this village, take this bit, and gradually moving in until they had big enough or strong enough to take over the whole country. When you think about it, 200 years, that's 4, 5, 6 generations of men, if you will, not counting the women, of men. You'd have people at the end who had no idea who their great grandfathers were, who actually first started. It's a long period of time. Look what's happened in this country. We were just talking in the break there about 200 years ago. Do you know what was happening here in 1817? Well, I do, because I looked it up on Google. James Madison was president, okay? We had Mississippi was the latest state, the 20th state to be into the Union. They split Mississippi into two, and part of it became Alabama territory. So much has happened and changed since over 200 years, just in this country. You can imagine back in BC times, the same thing's happening. Things change. So perhaps it wasn't all cut and dried. Perhaps it took a lot longer than we think. God sometimes works in much slower ways. His timetable's a lot different to ours. Anyway, be that as it may. However, if you said, excuse me, it seems logical that the Jebusites were just, intermarried and eventually became part of the Israelites, as happened in so many other areas. But if you read an hypothesis, it's called the Jebusite hypothesis. What else? It says that the Jebusites persisted as inhabitants of Jerusalem, and in fact comprised an important faction, right, in the kingdom of Judea, Judah's tribal area, kingdom, which included Jerusalem. I mean, there's some very notable figures from the Bible who were Jebusites. Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet. Who are they? Nathan the priest and Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, anointed Solomon king. Okay, they were Jebusites, or whatever passed for those. Bathsheba, the queen and the mother of Solomon, was a Jebusite. According to this sort of hypothesis, and I forget, I think I got it I read it in the local library here, so perhaps it's still in there. That after a struggle for who was going to be in charge of the priests in the succession for David, the family of Zadok, in actual fact, became the sole authorized Jerusalem clergy. In other words, okay, Zadok, your family, you're the priest. You got the temple for life. You got it, right? So that a Jebusite family monopolized the Jerusalem clergy for so many centuries that eventually they became, so assumed into the local culture that as to be indistinguishable from Judeans or Judahites or whatever you want to call them. Which is kind of ironic, isn't it? That the most powerful people in the kingdom, around at the time of Jesus, were in fact descendants of the Jebusites who were there in the first place. Go back a bit. The book of Chronicles, I know Chronicles and Kings is hard reading for some people, I know. It tends to be a bit repetitive. But the book of Chronicles states that the inhabitants of Jebus, and for the sake of the Hebrew Bible, we're going to assume that Jebus means Jerusalem, forbade David coming to Jerusalem shortly after he was made king. Joab went up first, if you remember, and took the city. It became, because of that, became the chief and the captain of David's armed forces. However, if you read some classical rabbinical literature, and believe me, that is hard going, but if you take the time and read it, the Jebusites derived their name from the city of Jebus, which was the ancient Jerusalem. This is what they say, which they inhabited. And these sources also argue that as part of the price of Abraham's purchase, if you remember, he purchased the cave of Machpelah, the cave of the patriarchs, which lay in the territory of the Jebusites, that the Jebusites made Abraham grant them a covenant, made him a promise, that his descendants would not take control of Jebus against the will of the Jebusites. And they engraved that covenant into bronze. And say the rabbinical sources, the old Jewish sources, say that the presence of those bronze statues, they made some statues and carved on the promise on them, that is why the Israelites weren't able to conquer the city during Joshua's campaign. You remember Joshua couldn't conquer them, all right? And then, of course, it goes on to state that when King David came along and set siege to Jerusalem, he too was prevented from entering the city for the same reason. There was this promise and the statues. Now, this is folklore and legend and hearsay and things like that, but most of these things you get are based on some remembered fact or some remembered deed. And so what David did was he promised the reward of captaincy. You can be in charge of the army if you could destroy the bronzes. Let's destroy the bronzes, we can take the city. So Joab performed the task and, of course, get the prize. The covenant, the rabbis kind of dismissed the covenant as being invalidated due to the war that the Jebusites fought against Joshua. In other words, what they're saying is, they protected it against Joshua, but they weren't any good against David. But nevertheless, David, according to the rabbis, now you won't find this in the Bible, according to David, he paid the Jebusites the full value of the city, collecting the money from all of the Israelite tribes, so the city became the common property. Now, that's an interesting theological argument because Jerusalem was in the tribal domination of Judah. And as it became more and more the central figure of the Israelite faith and of the nation, then Judah enjoyed a certain prominence because it was their city, in their territory. But if the rabbis could convince people that everybody contributed to pay for this thing, then it's not really their city at all, they're just caretaking it, it actually belongs to all of us. Now there's that passage in the book of Samuel which refers to the saying about the blind and the lame. Remember, they'd have to kill the blind and the lame to attack this. There's a midrash, that's a commentary on the Torah. It argues that the Jebusites had two statues in their city, with their mouths containing the words of the covenant between Abraham and the Jebusites. One statue depicting a blind person, and the other representing Isaac, I guess, and the other one depicting a lame person, which was Jacob. A lot of modern day politicians in that part of the world, in the Palestinian area of that part of the world, claim that the Palestinian Arabs are descended from the Jebusites. Now that's right up to modern day. We're going from 1900 BC to today, 2017 AD, or Common Era, okay? And the reason they say that, of course, is to argue that the Palestinians have a historic claim to Jerusalem that precedes the Jewish one. Now think about that. Politicians today in Israel, or in Palestine, Palestinian politicians, are going back to parts of the Hebrew Bible and some of the rabbinical writings and some of the other discoveries and saying that we are descendants of the Jebusites. How they do that, I don't know. I haven't looked into it. But they are saying we're descendants of the Jebusites. Therefore, we were there before you. Now, 3,000 years, 4,000 years later than the events when David conquered the city, the argument is now that, but because we were there before you, we're entitled to have Jerusalem, not the Jewish people. So who the Jebusites are is important, or to know who they are is important because it helps us understand what the arguments and some of the divisions between the Arabs and the Jews are. There's a fairly modern Palestinian Arab claim that they are descended from the Canaanites. if you read there's a Palestinian encyclopedia, and the name I forget for the moment, but it's basically a Palestinian encyclopedia. It asserts that the Palestinians are the descendants of the Jebusites, who are of Arab origin, describe Jerusalem as an Arab city because its first builders were the Canaanite Jebusites, whose descendants are the Palestinians. And if you think about that, here we have, in this modern day and age, politicians basing a claim to the rightful, whether they should have the land or the city or whatever. In one case, the city of Jerusalem, in another case, the whole country of Israel, basing on claims set back 2000 BC, 1900 BC, 1800, 1600, all through that era, because the people who lived there, were, they say, their ancestors, the Jebusites. But in fact, if you look at it really closely, the Canaanites were not a true Arab race. They were a Semitic race. The whole Canaanites, not, and everybody. I mean, the Hittites came from Turkey. The Amorites, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, came from somewhere else. There's a big, huge Egyptian influence in there. I mean, the whole area was owned and run by Egypt way back during the Pharaoh's time. It was a what do you call it? Vassal of Egypt. So you think, well, so what does it matter? What does it matter about the Canaanites? Or the Jebusites or whoever they were? What does it matter today? Well, today people are still squabbling, I use the term lightly, over who is entitled to have what. I mean, it's the same sort of principle as somebody, and I'm not sure this is a fact, but as somebody who is living on Indian lands, or what were Indian lands in the West. And they've got, I don't know, since 1800, 1700 and something, their family's been living on these lands, okay? And now the local Indian tribe is saying, no. We were there first. We want it back. I mean, we've seen that happening, be it oil wells or water rights or what have you. We see that happening today. What's interesting, that things and events and peoples who lived 3,500, 4,000 years ago, their squabbles, their who was who and who was where and this sort of thing have come through the ages. How is it remembered? I mean, is it passed on word of mouth? How do you know you're descended from the Jebusites? Because somebody told you, or because I doubt you could trace your ancestry back. You can say that, well, all the people who lived in Jerusalem at that time were Jebusites, and the Israelites came in, but they merged. So how do you pick out the Jebusite from the Israelite? It's an interesting comparison, to me anyway, that in this 21st century, here we are squabbling about who was here first, and we're using biblical sources to bolster our claims. It's kind of odd, isn't it? Again, we go back to that rather interesting theory that I brought up last week, where some scholars believe that the Israelites did not come in across the desert, but were immigrants from Egypt during the time when Egypt was in control of Palestine, that emigrated, to Egypt by a natural, trek across the desert. Obviously, you've got to do that, and then lived in the Canaanite territory, and gradually became a a tribe of their own, if you will, and then bit by bit became more powerful and took over. So it was like an internal takeover. And then you say, well, what about the stories about Egypt and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all that? Well, there's stories that come up from that transition into Israel. You know, I don't say that's what happened. I mean, I tend to follow the Bible thread, if you will. But it is, we see things in the Bible that tell us this happened and then that happened and then happened, and we assume, oh, they just went like that. What it doesn't give you is a time frame to say, oh, this happened and then 200 years later this happened, or 100 years later this happened. Lots of things can happen. And again, we're not talking about millions of people. A lot of people have the idea that when the Israelites came off the desert, they were like, 2 or 3 million people. I don't think even today the desert in around Israel, between the Red Sea and Israel proper, could support 3 million people at any time. People exaggerate the numbers, People, it's a natural human thing when they're writing down, oh, we beat 3,000 of them when there was only maybe 1,500. People say, oh, there were 25,000 people at this football game. Well, maybe not. Okay, but it sounds good. Okay, and the biblical writers were guilty as anyone else of putting the rosiest picture on things like that, on who, in fact, how many people were there. The Israelites, if they came off the desert as a tribe, would have come across all these other tribal groups living in Canaan. And to survive, they either had to fight them off. I mean, nobody's going to give up. You've lived there for generations, and here comes this group of wild men off the desert, and they want your land and your city. You're not going to give it up. Now, I'm sure a lot of it was natural assimilation. Take a little, sit tight, take a little bit more, intermarry. I mean, the Bible's full of stories about God saying, you took wives from the other tribes, you shouldn't do that. But they did, and it carried on, it kept on going. Kept on going. So, the Jebusites were, in fact, whatever you want to call them, living, according to the Hebrew Bible, in the area of Jerusalem, or Jebus, despite the fact that outside of the Bible there really isn't a reference to them at all. But let's take the Bible, as this word. So, they're living there. Joshua tries to take the city and can't. And then a long time later, here comes King David and tries to take the city. And, there's all sorts of legends about the statues preventing him and this sort of thing. But in fact, David takes the city. And surprisingly enough, doesn't slaughter everybody in it. Now, depending on which viewpoint you support, he either paid the Jebusites for the city, which is probably a bit unusual since the Israelites as such, being by that time not a nomadic tribe, but certainly a bunch of people who didn't carry treasure chests of coin around with them. The idea of paying for the city is probably not very valid, although it's a good idea. And it makes a good point that the rabbis were very keen that the whole of Israel, the whole 12 tribes, should have the responsibility of owning Jerusalem rather than the one tribe of Judah, which in fact, when it came to the national split much, much later on, of course Judah took the south and the other 10 tribes took the north. And of course Benjamin stayed with Judah because they didn't have much choice, they were smaller. But again, who were the Jebusites? They were the people who had a dramatic impact on the early days of King David's rule in Jerusalem. And they're also, today, their impact is being felt on the conflict in Israel today between the Palestinian Arabs and the Jewish population. There is not many stories in the Bible or accounts in the Bible that you can relate from that far away to today. There's one or two. It's important for the Palestinian Arabs to have Jerusalem as their city because it is the center of the land, and it has been for centuries. It's important for the Arabs also to have the whole land as an Arab land as opposed to a Jewish thing, because in their view they were there first. So there we have it. Next week we're going to move on, probably not sure yet whether we'll do the Amorites or somebody else. The Amorites are a really interesting group of people, and again have a big effect on the way things are today. So keep your Bibles handy, especially the Hebrew, the Old Testament, and I'll be back with you next week. Until then, good night, God bless.